All right, so gentlemen, we come back to the table to resume the conversation on signal path. Are we all in agreement that we're still on signal path?
Yes, sir.
It's been a week. So just to quickly recap where we left off last time, and in order to help facilitate this, I'm going to bring in a visual aid made by the amazing Mahia and share some of this delightful work. So we talked about the guitar comes in. We hit any impedance sensitive pedals that we may have. That could be a wah, that could be a fuzz, that could be a treble booster, anything that wants to really see a guitar immediately. Then we go into our input buffer, whatever that may be. I put, as an example, a stowaway buffer, but this could very easily be a Goodwood audio interfacer of the many varieties that they make. Then we went into dynamic pedals, so that could be envelope filters, octaves, potentially whammies, compressors. Then you would go into distortion pedals. Now, I put the order that I talked about as far as having higher gain close to the guitar, lowest gain further from the guitar. I know that there was some contention on that. So we can maybe go back and talk a little bit about that more. We then went into boost and EQ pedals. Typically the EQ I put after the overdrive section. I think most of us agreed with that. And we talked about also boost pre and post a little bit. So as though the boost maybe came earlier before the overdrives. And we can touch more on that too. And then we went into volume pedal. And the volume pedal, we talked about that also being able to be up front. And the consequences of those things, again, up front would be if you want to kind of mimic what the guitar does on the volume pot. So when you roll down, it gets not only quieter, but it actually attenuates the gain and cleans things up. Or if you put it in this position, as we have it here in this diagram, as you roll it up, it's going to get not only louder or softer, but it's not going to change the fundamental tone or attenuate the gain structure of whatever's before it. It's just going to be like a master volume. It comes up, it comes down. It's not going to change the elements of the tone of things coming before it. So that is where we left off. Is there anything that we want to add to caveats to any of that order? Do we want to dive in a little deeper into the distortion overdrive order stuff, volume pedal order stuff, before we get on to the next sections?
Well, I mean, I'll say from the last podcast, I have went home and did exactly what you talked about, doing the high gain to low gain on my board to try it out, because I just never really did. And I actually liked it a lot better. So I am going to plus one on you on the high gain to low gain. I just had a better response out of my drives, personally.
So you've converted one, Mason.
Basically.
One point for Mason. I think the one where this comes up the most for me is I always get asked, where should my boost go? And it's often after overdrives or before. And it really does make a massive difference. And it kind of relates to this, the high gain to low gain or low gain to high gain in your drive stage. And and if you want to basically push those pedals that come after a drive by putting more gain in front of them or more volume, it will just change the whole structure of it. And so I think I'm probably still leaning on the camp of try both and see what works better for you. And it will be a drastically different sound. But I would not disagree with start with high gain to low and then see what you like. And you might do exactly what Brian did, which I have to say, Brian, I love that you did that. And I wish all of the people I talked to did the same thing. Like, we chat about it and they go home. They don't take my word for it or Mason or your word for it. They go home and like, oh yeah, I now understand because I did it. I understand what they're talking about, rather than, okay, I'll just take you at your word and I'll preach that same gospel now moving forward forever, even though I've never done the work myself. And so I would just say, try it yourself, see if you can replicate it. If you can, awesome. Move on and keep going.
Yeah. There are no shortcuts in Tone Town. You got to take the scenic route.
It's a long winding road to Tone Town.
Yep. There's no shortcuts. You got to go and experience the full thing so you know. And I actually, this week, I posted a short on Instagram or their Reels about this signal path order in terms of the overdrive and distortion. And it was very disputed. And you know, I kind of gave it as a generalized rule as far as kind of why I'm thinking that way. And I'm thinking that way, you know, mostly thinking about just sort of the interaction of the circuits. And of course, no two circuits are exactly the same. The way that they interact is fundamentally different. And one person that I actually did think had good credibility in their response is actually a guy that I know, Adam Miller, who's a great guitar player, Two Rock in Dorsey. And he said, you know, I find it to be the opposite, but I'm only using really low gain pedals and setting them with really low gain. And in terms of his overdrives. And I could see in a scenario like that where you don't have anything that's really a bona fide distortion pedal, where it could work in that context, where the order, how they maybe interact with each other harmonically maybe has an advantage by positioning them in maybe different orders in terms of the staggering. But in terms of having like a JHS Angry Charlie or something that's like known to be sort of like a high gain distortion pedal or a Rat, I kind of find that when you slam those with other pedals, they tend to just become less defined. They tend to have less complexity because there's just becomes this blob of tone where you can't have the same articulation. Now, there could be some caveats to that. Like if you have a pedal before it that's slamming it, but it has a really interactive EQ, maybe you might be able to carve out some things to kind of make it cut more. But I think principally, if somebody really wants the sound of more saturation and they want to be able to actually control what that EQ is doing, they should honestly be just using an EQ. And I was like thinking, you know, really the thing that would be, if you really want to have ultimate control of pre and post gain boost, is you would either have an EQ in your loop switcher that is reorderable, and you could swap it pre and post so that you can move it before and after. And it's one of those programmable ones like a Source Audio EQ2. You could actually loop it so that you had an EQ before and after, or just move it before and after with your switcher. So you could either set a flat response with just a boost, you know, in terms of the boost fader, and that would just be hitting it harder. Or if there's a specific EQ that pedal needs to compensate for it when it's getting boosted to make it stand out more and it doesn't lose all of its definition, you could do that. Or move it after again if you wanted to have the boost after. That would sort of be the ultimate workaround, because the EQ2 could sort of fundamentally, if you're talking clean boost, it's fairly linear, but has some EQs to it. You're not going to get much more of a flat response than a really high quality equalizer. And so I thought maybe that's the best workaround, is because you could just tailor it to boost the exact frequencies that you need and the volume that you need in the place that you need it. So there's the hot take for today. EQ pre and post, or a switcher that can move things pre and post. Or get a Boss EQ200 or a Source Audio EQ2, which has two separate EQ loops that you could put in separate parts of your switcher.
Love it.
So
absolutely.
we resolve that.
I have one on this board back here, actually.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. For the exact reason.
Yeah. So I think it's a cool thing, but I do like the idea, because Brian talked about a boost pre. One of my favorite boosts to use first, and I haven't done this on every board just because of space reasons, but I do like putting an RC booster before my overdrive section. RC booster has some color to it. It's not a flat response, but you can get some compression. You have some EQs on it. You have a gain and a volume, and so you can add a little grit if you want it to add some grit. In addition to, you know, having the volume control. I like that up front, and that's kind of a Nashville trick that a lot of guys use, like Tom Bukovac and guys like that will put an RC booster before drives, and then we'll put like a Vertex boost after drives. So they have kind of like a more colorful boost that has some gain and some grit and some EQ. They'll use it to drive other pedals, and then they have a really clean boost afterwards that has no color at all and is just adding more output.
That's awesome.
RC Booster's a great pedal.
Yeah,
absolutely.
tried and
Such a
true.
great pedal. Yeah.
Tried and
It's
true.
easy to hate on because it was so popular for a long time and still has a great place.
Right.
But it's affordable. The EQ is awesome on it, and it just sounds great. It's a great sounding unit for a very fair price.
And I think it was a bold move that they went with Comic Sans MS for all their text on those early pedals. Shout out to Exotic for that. Nobody had the balls to do that on a guitar pedal, and they did it.
Yep, they're helping to pave the way to Tone Town. So it's a long journey, but they're doing
all
it.
the road signs are in Comic Sans.
Exactly. And black ink.
Yep. Okay, so one other thing that I didn't touch on in our recap is that we did talk about two modulation or multi-effects devices that have pre and post controls, like an H9 or a Mobius. And that was one thing that was omitted from the diagram, is that on some of those devices you could have a device that has one section wired before drives and one wired after drives, so you could affect pre or post gain with whatever modulation you might want, and that could fit in to before or after your overdrive section. Do we want to say any more about that before we move into modulation again?
I don't think so.
We kind of covered that one pretty good. Okay. I mean, it's just a cool trick that, some of these pedals have now. You can wire them in multiple places, and it's cool to see more and more companies taking advantage. It might be arguably kind of like in the switcher episode, we talked about loop reordering. To the majority of people, it's probably not going to be used, but when you need it, it's so handy to be able to route these things in multiple spots on your board.
Right.
And H9, Mobius, a few other pedals, EQ2, Source Audio can all do that, amongst many others. But very handy feature when you need it.
Yep.
I will say, in the pre-post talking, even though this isn't a modulation, even like pedals that are like that can do split loops, like the Brownie Protein, the D&M. I can't think of it's by Dan.
The Robert Keeley drive.
Yeah, that one. Okay, so like those ones, because they have the TRS, you could put like we'll say off the Protein. Like the Protein, you could put one side in the very front of your chain, and then you could use the split side, and it could be at the very end of your chain. Same thing with the D&M, because it has a drive and boost. You can do the same thing. Like, it's cool to see more companies coming out with that kind of stuff to where you can utilize it in a switcher, or you can utilize it in different parts of your signal chain. Obviously, you can't reroute it, but the same kind of concept can apply, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to the diagram potentially. Unless there's anything else we want to say about volume pedals, which we also, I feel like we covered it effectively in the last episode. And of course, you can go back if you're coming into this and you didn't hear the last episode. We kind of covered everything up until this point. Yes.
One thing on volume pedals, your guys' thoughts, let's say on a passive volume using the tuner out. That's one thing that also comes up a lot.
Illegal.
I advise against it unless you have an active volume pedal, like Layla mono volume. That is, I have to say, my ultimate favorite volume pedal, even though it's gigantic. But if it's a passive volume, I always tell people to try and avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that volumes, they're pretty swell. So.
Oh wow.
Oh
okay.
Wow.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Pretty swell.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we don't really even have to talk that much about that. I just thought it's a common question. Yeah. It's signal chain. We might as well just quickly.
Yeah, and the reason why is just so people understand is that it's a parallel load if you're running a volume pedal with a tuner out. And if there's no buffer, that means there's nothing to drive that loading without having a negative consequence on the overall tone. So, if you have, again, an active volume pedal, basically what it's doing is it's buffering so that it's driving, everything on both outputs, because it's basically just a split output, and one of those outputs goes to the tuner and the other output goes to the next pedal in series. Or it could be paralleled off the input. I guess it depends on it's most likely paralleled off the input, because if it was on the output, it would be muted and you wouldn't be able to tune when it's off. So that's the thing that I think is just problematic with anybody's rig, and honestly just putting the tuner in series is going to have less harm to the tone than putting it in the tuner out, unless again it's an active volume pedal. So Just keep that in mind. And most of the switchers now, if you're getting a switcher, they have built-in tuners or they have tuner out, so that's great. And if you don't have a switcher, I would just say stick with either a high-quality true bypass tuner, like a TC Electronic has a true bypass option, Peterson has a true bypass option, Sonic Research has a true bypass option. I suppose we didn't talk about tuners on this signal path. Should we just do that real quick, where they should go?
Yeah.
If we're going real basic,
why not?
Okay, so let me go back to our diagram again and blow this thing up. If you were going to add a tuner to this, where might you put it? Let's start with Brian. Where might you put a tuner in this fictitious signal path?
Well, there's two different ways. One, I typically would do first in, because you know, I've noticed some tuners you'll get a better response if it's very first.
Yeah.
Another option is if you're running a junction box that has your input but also has a tuner out, you could run it through there. It kind of just depends on the box. If it's like there's some boxes that are just, it's a passive, it splits it, maybe, it kind of depends. Anytime I use an interfacer or underfacer, if I can't, correct me, Grant, does the underfacer have a tuner out?
It does. Yep.
It does. Anytime, I haven't had the underfacer in a while. I've had a lot of the interfacers. I always use the tuner out. It's just more convenient, and the master mute is great for tune. You can tune off the master mute, or you can roll down the volume. Different options. So those are my two. If you're running it with a junction box, it depends if you have a tuner out, and if you don't have a junction box, I always do tuner first. It's just first thing in, get that best. I've had guys put it at the very end of the signal chain, and they leave all their effects on. They're like, I'm not getting an accurate tuning. Well, there's a reason you're not. So that's what
you're using a pitch shifter into your tuner, and it's just the tuner's just going up and down. I don't know what's going on.
Doesn't know what to do. Yeah, no, I had some guy. He goes, yeah, I use it for my master mute. I'm like, well, if you don't turn off all 11 of your pedals, you're gonna get interference. And he's like, it's been fine. And then he ended up having issues, and we moved it. And so.
I'd probably agree. I'd probably, in the diagram that's on screen, if you're watching on YouTube, I would probably put it at that input buffer. A lot of input buffers will have a split, like a buffered split, like what we were talking about with an active volume. And that could just be a really convenient place. If it's something like a Boss, the world's most popular tuner, like a TU3 or something like that, you don't want to put it before your impedance sensitive pedals, basically right up front if it's buffered. If it's true bypass, you could argue that could be a good spot, but I'd probably just, by principle, put it right around that input buffer before the overdrives and move on with your day. Be happy.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with those. If it's a buffered tuner like a Boss pedal, you would either use it out of a tuner out of your input buffer, or you would kind of put it in place of the input buffer potentially in the course of this diagram and after any of your impedance sensitive pedals like fuzzes, wahs, treble boosters, things like that. And if it's true bypass, then you can put it right up front. I mean, the consequence there is really just the same as maybe adding another foot or two of cable. So it's not that consequential to the overall tone if it's a true bypass tuner. The other thing that should be said is that if you have an input buffer, let's say like a Mesa Boogie Stowaway and not a cool interfacer box like Grant makes, is that all a tuner out is a paralleled output off of the input buffer. So you could just as easily make a Y cable off of the output of your input buffer, and it will function exactly the same way as a tuner out would. And so if you wanted to do that and you wanted a tuner out, but let's say your Mesa Boogie Stowaway, the one that we have pictured in this diagram, just has an input and output, you could use a Y cable off the output and send one side of it to the input of the tuner and send the other side of it to the first pedal in line. And that would be doing exactly the same thing as what's happening inside of any sort of interface box that has a tuner output. So just food for thought on that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Love it.
Yeah, workarounds. So let's go into our post-modulation, post-gain, post-boost, post-volume pedal, which is, again, modulation. Now, I put some effects in our diagram here, if you're watching on YouTube, that could actually be pre or post, depending on sort of what your preference is. And the reason why we separated these out is because we did talk about some pre-post options in certain effects, like an H9 or, again, a Mobius, where a lot of these individual effects are built into one unit as sort of a Swiss Army knife. And so maybe we should talk about modulation, and then maybe talk about which sorts of modulation devices would we ordinarily put after overdrive and distortions, and which ones might come before overdrive and distortions, with that in mind.
I would. Sorry, Brian, do you want to go?
No, I was just saying, let's go. That's all.
Okay, let's
ahead.
go. So I have to be honest. I may lose a whole lot of people here, but I am not the biggest phase guy, phaser. Sorry, and same kind of goes with flanger. But I do think they have a great spot depending on the type of sound you're going for. Typically, though, I would probably keep those after the overdrives. And the one that kind of is up for grabs in my mind, in my opinion, and it is just an opinion, is like a vibe type pedal. And I think that can really go before or after drives. And
this is univibe, not vibrato.
Okay, yeah, great.
Yeah,
good clarification.
You're saying univibe, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's probably my argument. But again, I would go back to, if I was having a conversation with someone that was talking signal chain, I would say this is your option. You can put it before or after. But I would say it with a caveat of, if you put it any of these pedals in the diagram, so phaser, flanger, and vibe and stuff, if you put those before the gain section, their effect when on will be diminished, because they're then running into the overdrives. The overdrives are going to put gain on top of that effect, and it's going to sound like you almost turn the mix down on, or the effect level down on all those pedals. Whereas if you put them after, where they're in this diagram, when you turn them on without changing any settings, you turn them on, it's going to sound like that effect level has been turned back up. So they'll have more of an effect on your sound after the drives, less of an effect on your sound before the drives. And again, that's not right. Neither one is right or wrong, but I would suggest you do what Brian did this past week. Go home, try it, and see which one works better for the sound that you're going for, knowing that neither one is more correct than the other. It's just what works for the sound you're going for.
Yeah, no shortcuts to Tone Town.
No shortcuts.
No shortcuts.
Yeah.
Brian, what do you think?
I would say, if we're going off of order, I'll get a lot of people that will come through and they kind of have an idea of what they want, like when it comes to like their modulation order. I get a lot of the questions of like the chorus pedal, really, honestly, is like where should my chorus be in my chain? Where should my tremolo be in the chain? And I've had guys that run them in the very, very, before the overdrives, is because it's the sound that they want. They like how that modulation sounds hitting the overdrives, and it just changes the overall tone of the pedal and how it reacts. Some guys are like, oh no, I want all my modulations after. So I'll go off of what they want. If they're like, man, I'm totally open, I'll typically, it's actually funny, this is kind of the order that this board behind me is in when it comes to a lot of, he has the MXR, he has the Phase 90, he has tremolo and these type of pedals. So this order that we're showing, if you're watching on YouTube, where it has the vibe, I need glasses, I can't even read this. The vibe, the flanger, the Phase 90, the chorus, the tremolo, that's a pretty common order. You'll see. Occasionally you'll get people that want to change up where the chorus is. It also depends on if, and I know we haven't mentioned this, if they're going to be splitting out to do an effects loop. If they want those modulations hitting the front of the amp or in the effects loop. So, if those are in a box, or if the box is splitting out to go to the front of the amp and then, the effects loop. So it kind of just depends. But I would say this is really spot on for the order, personally.
I would also say as well for you mentioned effects loops, for wet, dry, wet, or if you're using a dry out, it's really, especially if you're running parallel effects, parallel delay, reverb, and they're on kill dry, so only delay repeats, only reverb decays coming through. If you're only getting a chorus going to the wet section and not to the dry amp, it's going to be a lot harder to hear. Same for, flanger and phase, all that. So it, again, in experimenting, it could be good in this diagram to split to your dry amp and test it after phase or after trem, and just see if you like having that in your dry amp as well as in your wet amps. Whereas you might just think, oh, I just need to do it after the volume, and only the modulation, time-based pedals, those will only go to the wet section. But if you're running those in parallel, it could be a good experiment to try putting a few effects you wouldn't normally think to put in your dry amp as well, just to make sure they really come through when they're turned on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, in terms of this diagram, again, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening, we'll try to rehash sort of the what the diagram demonstrates the best that we can verbally. But of course, if you want the full enriched experience, you'll have to come to YouTube and watch what it is that we're referencing. I would say in this order, in most cases, I'd actually put the Univibe up with the impedance sensitive pedals in most cases, because if we're thinking historically of like a Jimi Hendrix or somebody of that nature, they're generally running their Univibe, into a distorted Marshall with, fairly abbreviated effects, maybe a Univibe, maybe a fuzz face, maybe an octave, maybe a wah. And there are some guys that really, if you're going with the Hendrix order, the vibe would come after your fuzz. But there are guys that proclaim that if you have a fairly clean amp, that it's better to even put the vibe closer to the guitar before any fuzz, because it helps keep some of the subtlety of the vibe intact, and they prefer that sound. I haven't exactly found that to be true in terms of the authenticity of the tone, because I think people forget that a Marshall, 100-watt Marshall Super Lead is fairly clean, actually, and a lot of the drive that Hendrix was getting surely had something to do with the amp. I would say it was probably a lot more speaker distortion because of the greenbacks, which aren't particularly efficient speakers, but a lot of it was still coming from the fuzz face. So I don't know that necessarily I agree with that estimation of how his tone was generated, but I'm just sort of thinking about, when I think about pedals like a Univibe or a phaser or a flanger, I sort of think of like the iconic players that sort of anchored those and how they might have used them. And if I'm thinking about a Jimi Hendrix, I'm definitely going to say that would come up front. But there's guys like Michael Landau, a session musician, that uses the Roger Mayer Voodoo vibe, and he uses that after his distortion pedals. So there can be a reason to put it there. I think it sounds kind of more like a phaser when you put it in that position, but some people may like that. Equally with the phaser and flanger examples of modulation, if I think of those iconic users like Eddie Van Halen, he also used it in front of a Marshall that was run dirty. And so if I'm thinking about it in that context, I would put the phaser and flanger in front of my overdrive section, because I would want to resemble more of the classic uses of those effects. Now, Of course, you could use them after, and again, as we said, there's no shortcuts in Tone Town. You got to do your own research and determine what's going to be the best sound for you. But for me, I always think of like those effects associated with Eddie Van Halen. I want to put those before the distortion devices and sort of resemble more of those use cases that we would have heard there. As far as chorus and tremolo or a vibrato pedal, if we wanted to add that in there, I would always put those after overdrives, kind of in the position that they're demonstrated here in the diagram, sort of after overdrive, after volume pedal. Put your tremolo, your chorus, your vibrato there. And we can get into 4-cable method and effects loop stuffs more as well, and kind of talk about how that order might be different. But that's kind of what I think in terms of how I would ordinarily think about this. And sometimes even tremolo might come later with reverb, like if you have a Flint or something like that. That's going to be kind of more like how it is in a Fender amp, where your reverb and tremolo are going to kind of be after everything. And in fact, even in a Fender amp, they're after the preamp section. So yeah. Anything else that we want to add to our modulation conversation?
I don't think so. I think you covered it well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Same.
So time-based stuff. Do we want to get into delays and reverbs and stuff that kind of comes more toward the end of the chain before we get back into the amplifier, presuming we're running all in front at this point?
Yep.
Yeah. Let's go.
All right. Grant, you want to take us first on this one?
Yes. So I actually, I have a very boring story, but it's quick. So I was always told that you should run delay into reverb. And ages ago, I was doing like a signal chain thing on YouTube, and I was showing like, this is what it sounds like. And this was in the setup, the lead up to it, so I could make sure that what I was saying was actually valid. And I ran delay into reverb, and then reverb into delay, and I was expecting to hear a big change, and I was struggling to hear the difference of reverb into delay, delay into reverb. And I see on your diagram here that you already have more experience in that than I ever did. I couldn't really notice much of a difference. And so a lot of people will say, run your delay into your reverb, reverb into amp or a buffer, and you're good to go. But I've still always run my delay into my reverb, but I know in the back of my mind, I didn't hear a huge difference when I did that. And then you can talk parallel and all that. That's a whole nother rabbit trail. But yeah, typically it's delay into reverb, but I would challenge you guys listening, try the reverse, and please tell me that I'm going crazy and it does make a big difference, but I couldn't hear much of it.
Well, I mean, anytime I've done I do the same, delay and the reverb. I talked to, I can't remember who it was. It was at a church I was at, and the guy was like, "Oh yeah, I do reverb into delay," and I was like, "Oh why?" He goes, "Because you get the reverb in the in the delays,
in the repeats of the delay.
In the repeats." Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
So I was like, "Oh," and he goes, "It just creates this whatever, like this." I can't remember. It was years ago. He said it to me, and like I was like, "Okay, like that's fine." I was young. I just had my own set way of doing things. I haven't tried it. I now know what I'm going to go try and do, because now I want to personally hear it. And if you're listening or watching, do the same thing. Like it's always intriguing to find new ways to utilize stuff, and just be like, instead of being like, oh yeah, this is how I've done it for 15, 20 years. Like, okay, well, try something different. That's the fun part about being guitarists and musicians. We can try, different stuff. So I have always done delay into reverb, but well, I guess I'm gonna go try it because I'm curious, because I've been told the same thing. Your reverb is in your repeats and it messes it up, or some people have said otherwise. So I mean, yeah.
And I think for like, if you think about it practically, I know that practically what's supposed to be happening. For the settings that I use for delay and reverb, I could not hear a difference to save my life. But if your delay is coming first and putting repeats after you hit it with a guitar, then every repeat plus the initial attack of the guitar is going to get reverb added on top. And you reverse that, and your guitar hits a reverb, you're going to get one string of decay and then repeats added on top of that after that decay. So if you just think logically what's happening when you switch them, you'll understand what to listen for. And even knowing that, I was just like, for the settings I use it for, it was killing me. Like, I should be able to hear this, and I cannot. Like, it was driving me crazy. So if you absolutely, cranked some of the settings, I'm sure it would be more obvious. But I wanted a practical, this is how I use it. Can I notice a difference? And for my settings, I was so disappointed that I could not. Mason, save us, man. Tell us what we're missing.
I would say that most people will run it in the order that it's shown in the diagram. They'll run their delays into reverbs, and that's kind of the... And I think a lot of that is precipitated by that people are envisioning, if they're going into, let's say, an amp with onboard reverb, that the reverb would occur last.
Yeah.
And so they're emulating sort of what they would hear, let's say, if they went into a Fender Deluxe reverb or something where the reverb is built into the amp. But I would say in terms of I think it depends too on sort of the era of music with which you want to emulate, because a lot of the old wet, dry, wet rigs in classic Bradshaw systems, the way that he made them was after the dry amp, and he would go with the line level output, usually the first mix that he would hit would be with pitch and reverb. Should be like an H3000 or an SPX 90 that was used for detune. And in that same mixer would also be reverb, PCM lexicon, reverb. And then that mix would then feed another mixer. So you'd have a parallel mixer that would in series feed another parallel mixer that would then have stereo delays. And then that would, feed the power amps in the wet left and right cabinets. And the reason that Bradshaw, liked to do it, and Bradshaw's not a guitar player, so he's sort of dependent upon the feedback that, the illustrious clientele that he had at the time was telling him, in terms of, guys like Michael Landau and Dan Huff and, all the session musicians that we all know and love. And invariably all those rigs, man, they all had reverb before delay. And it was for the reason that they wanted to have the reverb on every repeat of the delay. And, because not all of those effects were in the same parallel mixer. He put them in separate mixers so that there was two parallel mixes that were put in series. So it was like a series parallel thing. And so that could be a really cool sound. Most of us probably aren't going to do that on our pedal boards. So our easiest approximation is to just put reverb before delay. I like that sound. I think it depends on what it is that I'm doing. Like, I think that I like that sound if I have a lot of space. Like if you're playing a ballad and you have a lot of room for repeats to really trail off, it can be cool to have that as like an ambient texture. But I think if your delay is really more to sort of create some air in the sound that you have, and delay is kind of there, to just kind of feel like you have you're in maybe a little bit bigger room, you got a little bit more feedback, from an interaction from your amp. Probably you're not going to notice a whole lot of difference either way in that context, because you're not hearing a lot of repeats, you're not having a lot of space to really allow the reverb and delay to sort of dissipate in whatever the environment is that you're in.
Yeah.
Love it. I have to say as well, this could be the wrong time to bring this up, but tremolo, like we have it in the diagram before delay and reverb, especially if you use a bit, if you have a sound that you use or something with a heavy reverb that's quite saturated. One of the other experiments, we need to make an experiment list, homework to try this week.
Right.
But I think one of my favorite ones is putting a very heavy chopped tremolo after reverb. And it's just like a helicopter's landing. Like it's such a cool sound and so drastic from moving your tremolo before your delay and reverb. Again, same settings, completely different sound. Because the reverb is filling in all those gaps in the tremolo when the tremolo is before, but after, the tremolo gets to fully chop your volume to off, bring it back on again, no matter what the reverb is doing. And so as far as interaction with the reverb, I would definitely try moving the trem before and after and just have some fun with it. It's a very, very cool sound.
That's awesome.
So, and then I think the last thing in the diagram, let me screen share. All right. Last thing in the diagram here is, again, an output buffer at the very end of the chain. This is, again, just to drive the long, even though in the diagram, if you're looking at it, this output cable is fairly abbreviated. Usually we never have our pedals that close to our amp, and so we're going to need a nice low impedance output to drive the line all the way back to our amplifier. Arguably, this could be the longest cable of any cable in the series, so you definitely want to make sure that you are using something of high quality to bring that signal back to your amp with as little to no coloration as possible. We're probably roughly aligned in that and having a high quality output buffer. If you have something, again, like a Goodwood audio interfacer, it has the input and output buffers all built into the same box, so it kind of consolidates that from you needing to sort of disaggregate it as it's been shown in the diagram here if you're watching on YouTube. Anybody want to add or sort of talk more about this before we get into maybe 4-cable method or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm curious because you guys might know this. I don't have a lot of experience using these with like radial SGI boxes. I'm not sure if either of you, with those boxes, I've used them in the past, but do you need a buffer at the end of your chain if you're going into one of those, or is there something in, because I know it converts it to like a different, then sends it down to XLR and then converts it back and it's into your amp. It doesn't have a buffer inside, does it?
It's active. I'm trying to remember what the specs are on it though.
Yeah,
because I know you can.
It's low.
Mess with
it's a low.
Yeah,
it's a low output impedance, and it converts the signal from an unbalanced single-ended system like what a pedal board is, and makes it a balanced system, and then converts it back to a high impedance signal back at the amp. I would say put a buffer there. In the event that you don't run into an SGI system and you need to have something to be able to drive the line, it's not going to hurt what the radial is doing, or if you have any other brands like the Pinstripe or the new Walrus versions or anything like that. It's not going to hurt anything if you do that. It's just going to be a good idea in the event that you don't have any sort of low impedance or changing it to a balanced signal box like an SGI. You're going to just have a more consistent option where you're not going to be stuck if you're like, oh god, now I have to drive with my Boss RV5 and that's got a 1K output impedance, and I know it's not that good at driving my 30-foot cable without introducing other artifacts.
I was just curious. I've had a couple people ask me that. They're like, oh, do you need a buffer if I'm running? Because I had one gentleman, he had an SGI from his wireless unit rack in his rack going down to his board and then through the board and then hitting another SGI and going back to the rack to hit some other stuff.
Whoa.
And he's, just like, and I have another board over here where they have buffers in their racks and stuff, but they're also running 75-foot 4-cable method loom, so it's a lot of cable. But yeah, he was like, do I need a buffer? And so we kind of talked back and forth about the pros and cons and tested them, and he's like, is it damaging it? And I was like, I don't think it's damaging it personally, and I tried looking up specs, so I was curious, so that's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a contingency, it's good to have there in the event that you don't have your SGI. I mean, in those particular situations, if it's 75 feet of cable, I mean, technically a good buffer should be able to drive that no problem if it's, any decent amount of cable. But those SGIs are really handy, especially if your amps are off stage or things like that. They can be really, really helpful. Grant, anything on this you like to impart?
I don't really think I have much more. I think the only other thing that we didn't, well, there's probably many things, but one thing that came to mind with the placement of the volume and talking junction boxes is where you want to mute your signal as well. And just like super quick, if you mute where the volume is in the signal path before your time-based effects, when you mute, you're still going to get the trails of the effects going through, the decay of the reverb, all that, until they die down. So you can start tuning while you're still creating sound, in air quotes. If you put the mute after your time-based effects, at the very, very end, then as soon as you hit the mute, you're done. But the pro to that is if something's going crazy on your board, you're oscillating, DM2, and it got away from you, you can hit the mute and nothing is going to your amps. So just placement of a mute is a good thing to think about. Even that affects the sound on your board when it's hit, and what you can do with it. But I did have one question I actually want to get your guys' thoughts on. I'm going to be honest, I didn't really know the answer, kind of hoping this person isn't listening. A vocoder pedal for a pedal board. That is not one I have experience with. I was assuming that it could go in both places before overdrives are at the end, but I was thinking through it, and I'm like, I think on my board I'd probably want it at the end. But I was just didn't really know. And I'm talking, it just has an input an output. It's not the not the
Does it
type
have the
that
mic?
goes between. No mic. Sorry. So that's what I wanted to clarify. It doesn't go between your preamp or power amp and your speaker on your amp. Just pedalboard friendly, no mic on your board. Vocoder style effect.
What are they using it for?
Is it that Boss? Is it Boss one? Is it the Boss one? You're talking about the Boss vocoder?
Was it the Miku? It wasn't the Boss one. It was a different one.
Okay. Yeah, because I know of the Boss, the red one, the vocoder, that one.
That one has a mic line in. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it for mic? Is he trying to use it for a mic?
No, it's just 1/4 inch in, 1/4 inch out. Just a vocoder style effect.
I mean, is he using it to kind of do like it
was just an add-on option. Like, I think I'm going to add this in. Where do you think I should put it?
Got it.
And, it's just not a common question for me. It kind of stumped me. And glad to be stumped, but also I was just thinking like, oh, this is what happens when you get an effect that isn't common. Yeah. Other than just sitting down and trying it out, where would you guys, gut reaction, where would you guys put it in your chain? It makes me feel better you don't have an instant answer.
I don't. I've never done it.
I got your answer.
Okay, please.
I'm gonna guess in the beginning. Personally, I mean that's what I think. If it's like a talk box, if it's doing like a talk box, I don't really know. I'd have to Google it.
Talk boxes are at the end.
Oh, okay.
Normally.
In between the
because they're like because they when you hit a talk box, it becomes your amp, right? It bypasses the signal after it. So if it was like a talk box, but a vocoder is different because usually it's you're feeding your mic into it, right? And then whatever comes after it is the processing. Normally you're not getting processing effects before you get into the microphone. It would be after the microphone.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to do a Zapp and Roger effect, for people who know who that is. It's definitely going to be after the microphone in those situations. And I think that's why on the ones that have the onboard XLR inputs, they're presuming that I think you're using the effect after, or maybe they have an effects loop in them that you can insert the effects into. But in either case, it's still after the mic. So I would say if it's in that case, and you're sort of trying to emulate that sound of how a vocoder might have been used, I don't know, like 80s music or something like that, you'd probably put it after. And then if it's, a talk box, usually the talk boxes are last.
All right. Okay.
So you'd say vocoder at the very end, if I'm hearing you correctly?
Vocoder first, and if it's talk box, and I mean, again, I don't know what their intent in using it is. But yeah, that would be my instinct.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
I would also say if there's any for people that are listening or watching on YouTube, if there's any that have stumped you that we haven't covered, it would be cool, because I know there's no way we can cover every combination, but it'd be cool to see what has stumped you in the past. And I'd like to see, because I'm not saying I'll have an answer, but it's cool to see what people have come up against and what they've done to figure out the solution.
Right, and I would to our credit, I feel like we've anybody who's had questions in any of the podcast episodes that they've posted on YouTube, I think we right now are undefeated in terms of answering every question has been answered, including every follow up. So if there are things that come up here, please do feel free to comment in the YouTube comments. I don't think there's any other platform that will allow you to make commentary that we could engage with, at least. But you could always leave us a review, not with a question, but just to tell us what you think about the podcast and this conversation. One thing too, before we move on to 4-cable method, is really in terms of the signal path and the stuff we've talked about, if somebody wanted to run a stereo rig, it would really, whatever order they determine at what point it becomes stereo, you would just continue to run, both sides of the stereo output until you reach the amplifier. The only caveat is that you would need another output buffer on the second output. And hopefully you have something, again, like a Goodwood audio interface or some sort of interface box that gives you the ability to isolate one of the outputs so that you can get true galvanic isolation of one of the amps from the other. And you have a polarity switch or also known as a phase switch, so that you can make sure that the speakers are going the same direction at the same time. Because if they're not, it gives you what sounds like it's out of phase because one speaker is going back as the other is going forward. And so this ensures that you have it. Now, if you want to go poor man's polarity correction, you can always do an inverted speaker cable. So you just would take your existing speaker cable on one of your amps and you would just flip the leads on one side. And now you have an inverted speaker cable if you believe that you're out of phase or the polarity is wrong. This will ensure that. And an easy way to test which way is the best polarity if you have something like an interfacer is just hit the low E string a few times and push the button for the polarity in both directions. And you'll hear the bass really kind of disappears in one position, and then in the other it's really back in full and luscious. And you want it to be in the more full and luscious position.
Luscious is the key word.
Yeah.
Luscious.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I
One
think
question.
that would be, yeah.
Can I interrupt? Just one question I also
Please.
get about stereo that comes up a lot is, someone's running, just for a really simple example, they're running a stereo chorus. So they go mono in from maybe their phase 90, split to stereo after their chorus. They go into a timeline, and then they have a mono wet reverb. And I get this question a lot of how do I run my mono wet reverb in stereo after my stereo timeline? So the left cable goes to the input of the mono reverb, the right cable goes where? And the unfortunate answer is you cannot retain your stereo signal if you have to have a mono pedal after it. The only real option, correct me if you guys have any other ones, is buy another duplicate pedal, which is not a great way to go. So buy two mono pedals and run one on the left, one on the right, or more realistically, get a stereo reverb or whatever that next pedal is. You can't go from stereo to mono and retain your stereo field. You have to be stereo from the first stereo pedal onwards out to your 2 amps.
Yeah. I guess
so. That's a common one that comes up a lot, and I think it's just worth noting.
Could you fix that by running the mono first before the delay to get the stereo?
If you're up for that, if it's a pedal that you're up for doing that, or you could if you wanted to get complicated, you could run the mono pedal in parallel with your stereo signal, split the outputs to the left of the timeline and the right of the timeline, and you could do something like that. But again, like the workarounds usually end up being more effort than just replacing it with a pedal. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that there's a good solution. I don't have a good solution. It's just
sell
going to
the
be all
pedal,
compromise.
buy another one.
Or don't sell the pedal, buy another one.
Keep it. Make a mini board with that mono.
Yeah.
Because we all have extra pedal boards laying around. Let's be honest.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So if we were going to take sort of the order that we talked about, and we were going to morph this, let's say, into a 4-cable method, meaning an amplifier with an effects loop, where might things change for us respectively? And maybe just based on our time constraints, maybe we'll end today on 4-cable method, and that will kind of give people the sort of the broad strokes of mono in front of an amp. We talked a little bit about stereo in front of 2 amps, and then the 4-cable method. I feel like we covered a lot of the wet, dry, and wet, dry, wet stuff in episode 1. So if people want to hear more about that, you can go back and listen to episode 1, and we really go through it really thoroughly and spend a full episode on it. So this will kind of give us the broad strokes of the most common setups. So who wants to start us off? 4-cable method, how might we rearrange this diagram?
I know I'll just go really quick because I know we're coming up on time here, but if this was my rig, with the diagram that we have that just popped up on the screen here, if you're on YouTube, I would go to the front of the amp after the Vertex boost. So I would go Vertex boost into the amp input, effects send to the volume. And the reason that I personally prefer that myself is I look at the preamp of the amplifier, or the goods between the amp input and the effects send. I kind of look at that as another overdrive, and obviously it's a preamp. And so I look at that as something that is driving my signal, potentially adding some clipping if I'm running it pretty hard. And so the volume pedal after that means I retain that gain structure like we talked about earlier by putting that preamp before the volume pedal. Whereas I know a lot of people might run the volume pedal before the amplifier and then they'll go to the amp input after the volume. I prefer the volume after. Again, there's arguments that could be made either way, but that would be my personal preference.
Interesting.
I
see.
think
I've never
you're 100%
tried
right.
that. Yeah. I mean, I've never done that. I typically do the signal chain into the volume and then hit the front of the amp, and then the send hits so the way that my board is set up now, it's doing exactly that. It's going through all the overdrive section. It's hitting the volume pedal. The volume pedal is going into my Iridium. The left side is going back into the PVC to hit the wet effects. The right signal is going the dry out. But as we've said earlier, it's another thing now I want to try because I genuinely want to know how it sounds different. Because the great thing about us is we can rip stuff apart. Like my board's never put together. The one time it is now put together, now I want to pull it apart just so I can try all these things. Like my wife looks back at me. She comes into our front office. She goes, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Nothing. I'm doing nothing." She goes, "Are you selling? Are you buying?" I said, "No, I'm testing." She goes and walks out.
Testing is good for the budget. That's okay.
Headphones in, kids are asleep. I'm just like, "Yep. Oh, do you hear that?" She goes, "No." Oh, okay. It's just so. But yeah, so that's what I say. I typically do volume into the front of the amp and then hit the wet effects. But now I want to try it. Now I want to see how it reacts.
I think the biggest thing that you'll hear in terms of the difference by moving it after is again, if you're running some gain from your Iridium, or if you're running it into an actual amplifier that has an effects loop, is that when you go to attenuate the volume, it's going to also clean up the amp sound. So if you have it on a little bit dirtier setting and you roll the volume pedal back, it's going to be the same as if you put a volume pedal before an overdrive in that sense, where it's going to clean up the signal as well as attenuate. It's not going to act as a master volume. Whereas if you put it after your effects send, or in your case the Iridium, it's going to act as a master volume for the entire rig. You can have your burn tones or your gritty tones. You can bring it back. It's not going to affect any of that. It's just lowering the volume. One thing I will say about the effects loop, though, is you really need to be aware of the impedance of your volume pedal in an effects loop, because your normal 250K pot may not work properly. That's what's in most volume pedals, especially passive ones. Okay. That can be a problem. You generally want to go with a 25K pot. So in terms of volume pedals are out now, the active Ernie Ball volume pedal, it's not powered. It's just called active because I think they intended it was for active pickups. It has a 25K pot. A Boss FE500L is another option. The L stands for low impedance. That's going to be another one that could work in the effects loop. Generally, the high impedance ones don't do so well in the effects loop. So just a heads up, if you are going to move your volume pedal into the effects loop, you got to make sure it has the right impedance for the pot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good to know.
And you'd say as well, Mason, just for clarity's sake for that, any active volume you wouldn't really have to think too hard about. You can kind of
no,
chuck
if it's
it
an
wherever.
active volume pedal, it shouldn't matter. I mean, presuming that whatever that volume pedal buffer is can take the level of the effects loop, because effects
clipping.
loops have no standards. So some of them are going to be shooting out at +4, and others of them may be even higher than that in some cases, and it can go down to instrument level, which is around -20. But again, and there's no standards of effects loops. Everyone is different, so you're going to get a huge range of interaction depending on which effects loop you have built into your amp.
Gotcha.
And then I guess just for stating the obvious, so we talked about the amp input, the effects send, wherever you decide to put your volume around that. You go through all of your modulation, time-based output buffer, back to the effects return, and now your effects loop is hooked up in its entirety. Assuming that your guitar is plugged in to the beginning. And there's your 4 cables, a 4-cable method. Or it's stereo, you could call it the 5-cable. 2 effects returns. If your amp or setup can handle that, then there you go. And I mean 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there's so many methods, so many cables.
I will say with 5-cable method, I was super confused by the whole term for a while at first, and I've had people like, oh yeah, it's like when you run steering, you run the second, the right side stereo into like the front of a second amp. I'm like, yeah, I have one gentleman who jumped in, who accidentally walked in, Andy from I think it was our last time we talked, where he actually runs his right stereo line into the return of the effects loop, which I thought was cool.
That's the correct way to do it, because you're using 2 power amps and only 1 preamp. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. I had one guy who's like, oh, I run into the front. And then when he came to the concert, he's like, why isn't the second amp plugged in? And I was like, it's plugged in. And he goes, well, I don't see the cable. I was like, oh, he's running into the return. And he was like so shocked by that. He's like, oh wait, that's how you run it that way? I'm like, yeah.
He just blew his mind.
Yeah,
so only the power amps are in stereo.
What? Yeah, which I thought was cool, and it sounds great too. So yeah,
and that's how you should do it too, because again, you would have then, if you ran the right input or the right output of the last stereo effect in the effects loop into the input into an amp, you would then be getting a secondary preamp section. You would be getting half your delays in the power amp section after the preamp, and then the other half in front of a preamp. It wouldn't work. So typically 5-cable method is you go send out of the main amp into all of your effects that are going to be, sort of the processing effects, your modulation, delays, reverbs. Stereo out is going to be, the left stereo out, which is typically the mono out, is going to go into the return of the primary amp that has the effects send, and then the right output is going to go into the return of another amp. So none of the controls will work typically on that second amp where you're using the power amp. Maybe if it has a master volume, that might work. Maybe a presence control might work. Maybe a reverb control might work, but all of the EQs and stuff like that, those won't do anything. Yeah. So it's just a glorified power amp at that point.
Yeah.
And for the few of you that are wondering, can I use stereo effects loops? You can, but it is an isolation nightmare. You need 3 transformers to do it. And it's probably not worth the hassle, although some people decide to still go ahead with it. But stick with the way that we're talking about. 1 preamp, 2 power amps, and leave it at that.
Yeah, and if you do need to use an isolation transformer in that context, let's say 5-cable method, when you use an isolation transformer, if you're using it like outside of something, let's say like an interfacer, or you don't have an interfacer or whatever, you could get something from Radial. Radial has, I think it's called a stage bug. They have some isolation options. Lely has some nice ones with their P split, which just stands for passive splitter, and that has an isolated output. I would recommend in most cases putting that as close to whatever the input is that needs to be isolated, because most of these are actually, the transformers are going to be most effective the closer they are to whatever they're plugged into. So you can get the best possible isolation by running it as close to the amp as possible, and then just a short cable coming out of the isolated box and going into whatever the input is that's feeding.
Yeah.
But I think we did a lot today. We of course in episode 1 we kind of covered the first half of the signal path, episode 1 of Signal Path.
Part 1? Yeah.
Part 1.
Yep.
We covered a lot. We covered more today, and I think if you listen to both episodes in entirety, you'll have a lot to chew on. As we talked about, there are no shortcuts in Tone Town. You got to take the scenic route. Is there any final thoughts we want to wrap up on, Grant or Brian?
I'm good.
Okay, I'm sorry, man. The second time I've cut you off and I'm going
There's
first.
A delay.
I'm the worst Canadian ever. I would just say, just try it. Like, experiment. I know we probably said the same thing last week. And then when we, I guess, pull into our motels on the way to Tone Town tonight, we will look at the comments on YouTube. That's when we do our best replying. So please do leave some comments, leave a review and all that. But in the meantime, experiment. See what you like. Don't take our word for it. Just use it as a starting point and then go from there. And let us know your results. Comment what you found. I love hearing what people found. I love hearing what Brian found this past week. It's really cool to hear like the A/B testing going on and what you find. Yeah. Brian, over to you.
I'm gonna say happy experimenting. I mean, it would be kind of fun if we could start like a hashtag or something where people could hashtag or tag us, so we can, if they like do an Instagram story or something of them like testing it, and it doesn't have to be amazing quality, it doesn't have to be fancy stuff, but it'd be cool to see. I mean, I would love to see it. And you know, like I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna do it. Happy experimenting, and it's gonna be, you know, I'm excited to try something new. So yeah, have fun.
Should the hashtag be testing to Tone Town?
The road to Tone Town.
Road to Tone Town. Okay, hashtag Road to Tone Town for all of you.
Let's
testing.
do it.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Brian, I think you should probably be the first one up right before this
Or it could be
episode goes live.
route to Tone
I'm
Town.
down.
I don't know. We want to go route or road?
Or is it route?
Route.
We'll put the hashtag up. Maybe we'll talk about it next week.
Yeah.
I'll post something. We'll see.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Until next week, meeting is adjourned, and we will continue. Stay tuned for next week. Again, leave us a review, leave us a comment, give us a thumbs up, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and have a beautiful week.
See you guys.
See ya.